In this video, we are going to run the real independent samples t-test. In the previous couple of videos, we have imported our data and we have checked our assumptions for the independent samples t-test. Now you can go ahead and add the heading for running the t-test. You should be following from the previous videos, and therefore in your environment you should have these variables showing. If you need to reload these, just go through the code that you wrote before and run the code and just make sure that they're here. It'll come up again later. The assumptions are just making sure that the independent samples t-test is a good test to use for our data. We've gone through them and we know that it is a good test because we have passed all of the assumptions. Now we are ready to do the t-test in order to see if there is a difference between our two groups. To remind you, our two groups are explicit feedback and implicit feedback. And you can see our two groups here. So with this test, we want to see if there's a difference between the mean of these numbers, the average of these numbers, and the average of these numbers. The t-test code is straightforward. You just type t.test and then open parentheses. The first value you put in is going to be the first column. Here's your data frame. The dollar sign taps us into the column that we want to work with. The second column is the second value is the second column in our data frame. Next, we want to put paired equals false. We're putting paired equals false because this is an independent samples t-test, not a paired samples t-test. We want to put variance var.equal equals true because we know that we have passed the assumption of homogeneity of variances. If we did not pass that assumption, we could put var.equal equals false, and it would give us a different value in the output. And we want our confidence interval, our confidence level at the 0.95 level. And this is default, so you can delete it or include it, either way. Next, we want to assign this output to a variable so that we can look at it later. So I run this code. And then if I take this variable and take a look at it, this is our two-sample t-test, our independent samples t-test, and this is the output that we're looking for. One of the most important values in this output is going to be this p-value. We want the difference to be significant, and our level of significance that we're looking for is 0.05. So if the difference leads to a p-value that is less than 0.05, which in our case it is less, that means the two groups' means are statistically significantly different from each other. If this were bigger than 0.05, it would mean that the means are not statistically significantly different from each other. And the rest of these values are also meaningful and are things that you would put in your report that you would write up after, but we won't go over them now. Lastly, we've been saving all of these variables into these names throughout the test. We've been doing this so that you can easily look at all of them at the same time after you've done your test, and so that you can do this work, save it, save your file, and come back to it later and take a look at what your results were without having to do all the code again. So let's take a look at what we have. We've made descriptive statistics. We've made our box plots. We've made skewness for both groups. We've made kurtosis for both groups. We've done the Levene statistic, and finally our t-test statistic. With all of this done, we have all the information we need in order to write up a report. And if you're curious as to what the final finding is that we have here, we know that the differences are significant between the means of the two groups. And we can see here that these are the means here on this line. So our explicit feedback group had a mean motivation of 5.559. This is the average motivation. Our implicit feedback group had a mean level of motivation of 5.3. Remember, we were looking at the influence of explicit versus implicit corrective feedback on the motivation of learners. So from this, because we know the two values are statistically different, we can conclude that explicit feedback tends to have a greater influence on motivation than implicit feedback in learners who are learning a language.